This is a presentation from Winchester Academy.
Particularly, although it looked like perhaps I'd run over his puppy with a pickup truck. It was actively hostile, and he had his hat down over his eyes, and they kept getting lower and lower, and I thought, maybe I'm misreading him, but I need to check in with the student. So I found a pretense and made sure he got a handout or something at the end of the class, and I said to him, so how are things going in the class so far? And he said, well, Professor Barker, no offense. Okay, side note, something offensive is about to come, right? No offense, Professor Barker, but nothing that happened 500 years ago makes a damn bit of difference in my life, and you can't convince me otherwise. Now, I admit, the little historian geek brain of mine went off immediately. No, it all matters is, but he deserves an answer to that, and I have actually recrafted the beginning of that course partly to answer his question and to tell students who have followed why things that happened a long time ago do make a difference in their life. And I want to talk about that in a way today. I can understand why an 18-year-old would say that. I think everyone in this room may have experienced it. As we grow older, often we gain an appreciation of the past and history. And so an 18-year-old, I understand, but a large number of adults, I find, have that same idea today. So historians, it may not surprise you, of course, disagree with that fellow in the hat who stared me down so many years ago. Indeed, many of my colleagues in history have a tagline on their emails, and it's this one. It's a quote by William Faulkner from Requiem for a Nun. The past is never dead, it isn't even past. That's almost become obligatory in email taglines amongst historians. And I think it's because that single line really resonates so much with those us who study the past and who understand those important connections between the past and today. And so that line and those connections are something I hope to explore this evening. So just over a century and a half ago, Americans spilled each other's blood in unbelievable proportions in a civil war that took 750,000 lives, or 2.39% of the U.S. population at that time. A similar percentage today would mean that we would lose 7.8 million soldiers in a 4-year war. I want you to think about what that would do to our society, and also think, therefore, what it must have done to theirs. Now, it's true, Americans were on both sides in that war, and that certainly enhances, in a horrible way, the numbers, but it is nonetheless the fact that, you can see it here, that we would lose 7.88 million people, soldiers, in a 4-year war. When it was being fought, Americans on both sides recognized that slavery was at the root of the trouble. Those who want to deny this today create a straw man by simplifying the argument and saying, well, wait a minute, not all Northerners were abolitionists who wanted the immediate end of slavery. 100% true. In fact, I think sometimes Northerners like to create this fantasy that everyone in the North was opposed to slavery when that simply was not the case. Likewise, they say, if you ask the average Southern soldier, he might not have said, I'm fighting for slavery. Indeed, that's probably true as well. But there's something much bigger going on. Because slavery existed in the South, but not in the North. It had created two very distinct societies. And while the majority of Northerners did not want to end slavery in the states where it existed immediately, they did consider the institution wrong and wanted to make sure that it did not spread to the West. To white Southerners, any such critique of slavery or any such suggestion that it should not spread everywhere, perhaps eventually even into the North, was a threat they could not allow. It's true, they spoke about this existential threat in 1861 at the outbreak of the war as a threat to their civilization or to the Southern way of life. Yes, it is coded in that. But in the end, slavery in their minds meant much more than a simple institution of labor. The ending of slavery would have meant, in their minds, a race war, political anarchy, and economic ruin. White Southerners thought in these terms whether they personally owned slaves or not. Southerners seceded after the election of Lincoln to avoid this, what they saw as a grave threat to their peculiar institution. And they were clear about this. In a time where white Southerners did not mention slavery directly very often, note that even the euphemism of their peculiar institution when referring to slavery, 4 states directly stated in their ordinance of secession that the threat to slavery was the main cause of their leaving. Just weeks before the beginning of the war, in a speech in March of 1861, the new vice president of the Confederate States, Alexander Stephens from Georgia, gave a public address that made the motivation of secession and the formation of the Confederacy clear. After stating that the founders had believed that slavery was a necessary evil that should be practiced while it existed, but they hoped would eventually disappear, and that the founders harbored some vague notion that the phrase all men are created equal might even apply to enslaved African Americans, he went on to explain, our new government, the Confederacy, is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior races, is natural and normal condition. This, our new government, the Confederate States of America, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. He's very clear in the days leading up to Fort Sumter. And finally, I would point to this simple fact. How closely tied a state was to the institution of slavery was a direct predictor of when and if it seceded. States that had over 30% of the population enslaved seceded before Fort Sumter. Those who had a slave population between 25 and 30% of the population seceded after Fort Sumter. Those that had less than 25% slavery in their population never seceded. So that explains the 7 who go before Fort Sumter upon the election of Lincoln, the 4 that go after the war starts, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, and the 4 that never go, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, right? Now, it is true that you have to ignore, if you look at Texas, much of western Texas is not, it's really a frontier state in many ways, so you have to exclude the frontier boundaries to make it work, but otherwise it does fit neatly into that pattern. And so it's a little bit of an outlier, but it's Texas, right? I mean, it's, I think I've been forgiven that one exception. Yet generations of children from the late 19th century until the 1960s, and in some places beyond, were taught that the cause of the war was states' rights, not slavery. In this distortion, southern states believed that state power could trump federal authority, while northern states thought federal authority supreme. How did this myth come to pervade the public consciousness for nearly a century and continue to be held by too many Americans today? And why does it even matter? The answer is as old as the war itself and as current as today's news. In the first 18 months of the war, the restoration of the Union was the sole stated Union cause of the war. Then after September 1862, emancipation was added to the Union cause. Of course, this is the white view of the war. Slaves themselves realized that the war was about much more, and they began calling it the Freedom War as soon as it began. They began flocking to Union lines almost immediately, even though the Union Army was not promising freedom if they arrived there. By May of 1861, just a month after Fort Sumter, runaway slaves had reached Fortress Monroe, which was a Union-held fort on the coast of Virginia. And here things became very tricky because Lincoln was fighting the war. Remember, he was, after all, a lawyer, and he's thinking very lawyerly here. It is his, I would say, legal fiction during the war that because he thought secession was unconstitutional, therefore the South had never actually seceded. Oh, sure, they thought they had. They thought they had left the Union, formed a government, formed an army, but in fact they hadn't. They were still members of the Union because the Union was perpetual and unbreakable. Well, okay, so that works for him in some ways, but it also has a backlash. If the South is still in the Union, then isn't the fugitive slave law still in effect? So masters, who are indeed loyal Confederates to the enemy, were arriving at Fortress Monroe and asking to have their slaves returned under the fugitive slave law. And the commander there, a man named Ben Butler, who, by the way, is a brilliant sort of lawyer and politician and a terrible battlefield general, if you know anything about his battlefield exploits, horrible. But he was a lawyer, and he did make this one great contribution to the cause. He did not want to return those fugitive slaves, if that's what they were. He said, this makes no sense. We would be returning labor to our enemy. That is ridiculous. I have to find a way not to do so. So he thought about the problem, and he said, I have a solution. I will not return your fugitive slaves because, Southerners, you have been telling us for generations that slaves are not human beings, they are property. The property of an enemy can be confiscated during wartime. I declare these slaves contraband of war, and they are now the property of the United States government for the duration of the war. Using Southerners' very theory of slavery against them was a brilliant stroke. When Lincoln heard this, he said, yes, yes, wonderful. And so between May of 1861 and the Emancipation Proclamation, it was the sort of policy of the federal government that slaves who entered Union lines would not be returned to Confederate masters, but would be in this sort of limbo as contraband. They were often put to work in the camps, digging trenches, being useful to the Union Army. Lincoln and Butler both arguing that this is a double-edged sword. It benefits the Union cause and deprives the Confederacy of much-needed labor as they mobilize so much of their white male men into the armies, right? So that is what went on for a while. And so that is part of the story of the transition to emancipation. And that story, of course, then continues during the war as areas under Confederate control those slaves are freed by Union proclamation, and Union armies then make that real as the war progresses. And the freed people themselves do it by voting with their feet and leaving their masters and seeking Union lines. So by the moment of Union victory at the end of the war in 1865, slavery is largely dead. It will need the final ratification of the 13th Amendment in December of 1865 to kill it everywhere. But by the end of the war, it is dead in places like Alabama and South Carolina. It is not going to hold on in places like Delaware and Kentucky because the heart of slavery has been destroyed during the war. And therein lies the problem. The ending of slavery was a fundamental outcome of the war. But when the war was only about reuniting the states, then Reconstruction, the period after the war, could just be about how to put the states back together. But once emancipation became a war aim, then Reconstruction also has to be partly, if African Americans are no longer slaves, then what is their status in American society? That has to be a fundamental question that is asked during Reconstruction, again in the 12 years after the ending of the war. What is their future in American society? What is their status? So in the 12 years after the end of the war, as I said, called Reconstruction, white Southerners at first tried to reinstitute elements of slavery as nearly as they could without calling it slavery. They passed a series of black codes at the end of the war that did things like made it illegal for black people to own land, to own guns, to congregate in more than 4 people at a time. Many of the things that would be associated with slave uprisings before the war, now there's an attempt to deny them any rights or any economic advantages by the end of the war. But in 1867, 2 years into Reconstruction, Northerners decided that this had gone far enough, and they committed themselves to a much more radical approach, often called radical or Congressional Reconstruction. And that piece of history is often lost to us, whereas much of the myths I'm going to talk about later are all too vibrant in the public minds today. Northerners decided that something had to justify those 750,000 deaths. And so they instituted in the South tremendous reform. Black men were given the vote. They voted in large numbers throughout the South from 1867 for just a few years. They served in local offices. They served in the Congress of the United States from southern states. Indeed, the South Carolina state legislature for one term was majority black, which is not surprising because the population of South Carolina was majority African American at that time. And this entire history is largely forgotten today. You can understand that this experiment in a biracial democracy scared white Southerners to death. After all, what they had considered their property just a few years before were now voting, holding office, reforming the South, doing things that had been unimaginable just a decade earlier. And so white Southerners struck back. Through violence, intimidation, and assassinations, white Southerners used any means necessary to take control back of those southern states. And one by one, they overthrew these state governments controlled by often carpetbaggers, that is, northern whites who'd come down to bring about this change, African Americans themselves, and a few white Southerners willing to go along with this new program, although they're fairly rare. And they turned back all the changes of Reconstruction. They wanted new state governments to be safely under the old leadership that had led the South before the Civil War. And eventually they wore the North down. Partly it was the rise of the Klan and other such organizations. Increasingly, to have fair elections, the U.S. Army had to be deployed to make sure that those elections occurred without violence and intimidation and voter suppression. But eventually, Northerners lost the will to continue. There was a recession in 1873. They were called panics back then. There was a recession that made Northerners lose their focus. And honestly, a lot of Northerners thought, we're never going to change white Southerners. So support for this new radical program to reform the South in a fundamental Okay, so you can hear me again now? Okay, very good. Okay, so one by one, those southern states began to fall back into the hands of the white men who controlled those states before and during the Civil War. They immediately then began to roll back all these changes that occurred during Reconstruction. By 1900, whites in the South had systematically taken away black men's right to vote, installed Jim Crow laws, which did not exist during Reconstruction. Again, it had not always been that way, but was instituted in the late 1800s. Installed Jim Crow and used sharecropping to limit and define blacks' economic opportunities. And wherever African Americans or their white allies attempted to get in the way of these changes, white Southerners used lynching as a way to enforce the entire system. And so this system of this reinstitution of white supremacy is very much in place by 1900 and would continue well into the 20th century. And that story itself would be tragic enough, but that's not the entire South, not the entire story. The white South set out to do so much more, and this is the heart of my story. They began to erase the real cause of the war and the role of race and substitute the myth of the lost cause. This myth romanticized slavery, arguing that it wasn't really that bad and that blacks prospered under it, that the Old South had been a place of culture, social harmony, and chivalry, and that the Confederacy had been doomed not by its own decisions, but by sheer numbers and resources. Instilled in this lost cause was a strong religious notion. The new state leaders who ended radical Reconstruction were called redeemers. And I would point out this on the left, and we'll see this again in a minute, is an image from the poster for Birth of a Nation in 1915, which in some ways is a statement of this entire myth. On the right is a typical view of a medieval crusader. I think there are some similarities there. The South at the time was very much imbued with chivalric notions. Sir Walter Scott was widely read. Ivanhoe was perhaps one of the most favored novels in the South that talked about this sort of notion. And the myth of the lost cause contained all this. It contained all of these notions that rewrote the history that had once existed. In this reimagining, the Confederacy had died for the sins of the nation, and white supremacy could be resurrected and pushed forward with zeal. This lost cause proved a powerful balm for the white South's wounds, because in this myth, Robert E. Lee and his men had fought not to preserve a South whose very identity was tied to slavery, in which there is no honor or chivalry. There were chivalrous knights who had fought with dignity to uphold their political views of how the United States government was supposed to work, states' rights. If Northerners would leave white Southerners to their own devices to reimpose their supremacy over African Americans, if race and racial justice could be erased from the national consciousness and disconnected from the Civil War and Reconstruction, then there could be national peace. That was the deal that white Southerners were ready to make. And Northerners were somewhat complicit in this. Yes, white Southerners are in some ways the villains of this piece, but white Northerners deserve some of the blame as well. Their focus really in some ways was on the nation as a whole. They were thinking about the industrialization of the North. They were thinking about the white settlement of the West, the mining and cattle and ranching frontiers, right? Their attention had moved away from the South. They, in some ways, had grown tired of the sectional conflict and Civil War and Reconstruction. And furthermore, a vision of a society where white Protestant native-born Americans were the norm to which everyone else must conform was useful to white Northerners too. It permitted them to justify campaigns against the American Indians in the boarding school system. It allowed them to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and indeed allowed them to say that when people from ethnic groups in Europe came to the United States, they needed to be burned in the cauldron of the melting pot and come out as something distinctly unhyphenated and American. So all these distinct and vibrant lifeways were to be scalded and fused in the fires of the so-called melting pot. The racial oppression that occurred in the South was not distinctly Southern. It was only the Southern recipe from a larger cookbook written by white Americans in the late 19th century. Indeed, even amidst the protests of an aging Frederick Douglass, that the meaning of the war and its 750,000 deaths were being forgotten, white veterans from North and South began to engage in joint reunions and were nostalgic about the Brothers' War and mused to themselves, why did it even have to happen? Even the culture came to reflect these myths and trends throughout the first half of the 20th century. As I mentioned before, in 1915, D.W. Griffith made one of the most influential full-length films in U.S. history, Birth of a Nation. If you've not seen it, I have to say, I don't know if I'd go out and try to watch it today. It is almost unwatchable. But in this film, the Ku Klux Klan are the heroes. It is a crude but powerful telling of the myth of Reconstruction. Reconstruction, that is Congressional Reconstruction, attempt to build a biracial democracy, in this view was an abomination, which was only ended by the chivalrous Klan which came to the rescue, saving the South and particularly saving white womanhood. There is a famous scene in it where a black man, a white man in blackface, by the way, but a black man is chasing this this pure white, too many chaste, this pure white woman around on the rocks, clearly looking to sexually assault her. That's what's being implied there, right? And when she realizes she cannot escape him, she jumps from a cliff to preserve her purity. That scene represents every derogatory stereotype of black men and their supposed threat to the purity of white women, and it is the trope that so often justified lynching in the South at the same time. As you often know, that is the charge made against a black man, that he had somehow assaulted a white woman. Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, showed it in the White House By the way, he had been born in Stanton, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley, and had watched Stonewall Jackson's troops march up and down the valley during the war, so he'd been influenced by the war himself, and he was at heart a Southerner. Woodrow Wilson showed it in the White House and allegedly said, "It is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so terribly true." We do not know whether or not he actually said it, but that card appeared at the beginning of the film in almost all showings of it around the United States. It's a silent film, right? So the card goes up with Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, endorsement of it. And so that's the kind of credibility this view had in 1915. This film also helped lead to the rise of the second Ku Klux Klan. You may be aware the Ku Klux Klan had actually subsided after Reconstruction because many white Southerners felt there was no need for it anymore. The new system had been put in place, and except for lynching, there was really no need to have a Klan presence all the time. The Ku Klux Klan is revitalized in the early part of the 20th century, indeed in the very year of birth of a nation, 1915. So the attempt to rewrite history and the resulting damage is all too clear here. Yet, this attempt to rewrite history could be a little less ham-handed than that. That's a very obvious way. But I think if Confederates had had the technology to make a film about themselves, it would have looked a lot like this. It would have been Gone with the Wind. I mean, Margaret Mitchell, after all, had been deeply influenced by the society in which she grew up. And in some ways, Gone with the Wind is a love letter to this lost cause myth and this South that she wants to believe existed, but actually never did. It's a movie that is still beloved by many today who casually ignore the fact that Rhett and Ashley later in the film belonged to the Klan and go down to Shantytown to beat up some ne'er-do-wells who attempted to stop Miss Scarlet in her wagon on the way home, right? They're the Klan. That's the ideal of white manhood in that place. And it is both revealing and damning that two of the most influential and public and in some ways path-breaking early American films sought to offer a distorted view of history where Confederates and the Klan are the heroes, while African Americans, think about Gone with the Wind, Union soldiers, and anyone wishing to bring about a more just South are the villains. Sure, Mammy Sass is Miss Scarlet. True enough. But in the end, she is a faithful servant who contentedly stays with her enslaver through thick and thin, even though the vast majority of slaves did not do that during the war. This is the fever dream of a society desperate to preserve white supremacy and ignore the actions of hundreds of thousands of enslaved people who, during the Civil War, had not followed the path of Mammy and fled their masters at the first opportunity. The movies have long had a profound impact on American society and the American psyche, and I think this is proof of it. The dangerous reality is that in 1939, Gone with the Wind was the most significant Technicolor fantasy, not The Wizard of Oz. If I have ruined a beloved movie for you, and frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. So what about this business of states' rights? After all, let's take on the argument Southerners are making that was about states' rights, not about slavery. Surely secession is proof of this, that the South believed in states' rights and the North believed in federal supremacy, and that led to the Civil War. No. Southern secession proves that Southerners believed in secession. That's what it proves, nothing more. Before the Civil War and this distortion of history, 3 states were best known for their states' rights advocacy. South Carolina, you might know about the nullification crisis, and they're the first to go, right? Okay. Massachusetts, for their personal liberty laws, where they tried to disrupt the fugitive slave law, and Wisconsin, a southern state, a New England state, and a Midwestern state. Yes, Wisconsin. In 1854, Joshua Glover, a fugitive slave from Missouri who was living openly near Racine, an abolitionist hotbed. Southeastern Wisconsin had been one of the few places in the North where there were a lot of abolitionists who were willing to stand up and say that. They knew he was a runaway slave, and they sheltered him and harbored him and welcomed him into this community. In 1854, he was living just outside of Racine. And in that year, his former owner sent slave catchers to Racine to recapture him and return him to slavery. They planned rather well. They attacked his cabin at night. Joshua Glover was pistol whipped, and he had to be taken to the nearest place where there was a federal judge who could declare him a fugitive and return him to bondage. That was in Milwaukee. They traveled by wagon through the night and put him in the jail in Milwaukee until the hearing could be held. And what follows next says a lot about Wisconsin and states' rights. A white abolitionist editor named Sherman Booth got word that a fugitive slave was being held against his will in the Milwaukee jail waiting for this hearing that would return him to slavery. And so Booth rode on a horse around downtown Milwaukee and said, "Any who do not wish to be made slaves or slave catchers, meet at the courthouse this afternoon." They met at the courthouse. A group of white and black citizens broke into the jail, freed Joshua Glover. This is the part I always love. They decided they needed to get him way west of town where no one would ever find him, so they sent him to Waukesha, because back then that was way, that's the seat of the next county to the west. Eventually, Glover found his way to freedom in Canada. That was a safer space for him, given everything that had happened. And Sherman Booth is charged with obstructing the fugitive slave law. Well, spoiler, he's guilty, right? I mean, he actually incited a mob to free a man who was going to be returned to bondage under the fugitive slave law. So the case goes through the court system, and it gets to the State Supreme Court of Wisconsin. And the State Supreme Court of Wisconsin in the 1850s, is still before the Civil War, right, holds that Sherman Booth has committed no crime because the federal fugitive slave law is null and void in the state of Wisconsin. That's the same thing South Carolina did to the tariff in the 1830s, right? Now, it goes on to the U.S. Supreme Court. And by the way, I have a picture of Sherman Booth, I forgot. Okay, there's Sherman Booth. He's the one who's charged, okay? It goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the Chief Justice is Roger Taney. I know it looks like Taney. He said Taney, whatever. Roger Taney. Roger Taney's from Maryland. He has been pro-slave and pro-Southern in all his decisions his entire career. And he writes the majority opinion in Abelman versus Booth, the case in which this is finally decided. And in that case, he holds that Wisconsin's state Supreme Court has been in error because such assertion of states' rights ignores the fact that federal law is supreme over state laws and state authority. So a northern state tried to nullify a federal law, and a pro-Southern, pro-slavery Supreme Court says, no, federal power is supreme. If the Civil War was about states' rights, that entire story is just upside down, right? It makes no sense at all. In the end, I'm struck by James Mcpherson, one of the leading historians of this generation on the Civil War, wrote a few years ago in a book. He said, oh my, I'm sorry, I have a brand new phone and I don't know how to turn it off apparently yet. Okay, all right, okay. He wrote this a few years ago, saying the Civil War was caused by states' rights is like saying a barn burned down because it was on fire. The question is, what caused the fire? Debates over slavery and its extension into the West. And yet, because of the abandonment of Reconstruction, the persistence of Jim Crow, and the willingness of whites north and south to ignore the role of race in the history and as the cause of our greatest national calamity, the Civil War, we have never, as a nation, truly confronted the legacy of slavery, racism, and white supremacy. Some of these long buried and perplexing problems resurfaced during the Civil Rights Movement, but they were met by a backlash that relied on this distorted view of this past. In the 1950s and 60s, the Confederate flag began to reappear in Southern state flags, and Confederate monuments began to appear right at the courthouse door, right where African Americans were going to go and register to vote. And here we can see this is sort of tracks the number of Confederate monuments by year, and you can see this is the big blip, and this is early 20th century when all this is being firmly in place. And also, to be fair, when a lot of Confederate veterans are aging and want to leave a monument behind of what they had done, right? But then look at this second blip. From 1954 to 1966. Wonder what else was going on in the South during those years, right? It's literally Brown versus the board till the year after the Voting Rights Act, right? I mean, it's the heart of the civil rights movement. They were placed there, and it was argued they were celebrations of heritage, but they were clear messages to African Americans that the status quo was not to be disrupted. Legal segregation ended, black voting rights were restored, but many hearts were not changed. There was no truth and reconciliation process. The time for clear and effective reparations had allegedly passed, and new systems of oppression began to emerge. The mass incarceration of African Americans, many on petty drug charges, the disfranchisement of felons, and the gutting of voter rolls throughout the South and beyond. The disproportionate use of lethal force against African Americans by police, and undergirding all of this could be heard the chant, "It's time to get over slavery and the past and just move on." Yet the past is never dead, it's not even past. A century and a half after white Americans were first faced to confront the legacy of slavery and racism, we still have never really been honest about the past and its legacy in our lives today. In some ways, the Black Lives Matter protest arose in large part out of a frustration that society was ignoring these long-term issues that stretch back centuries, but as I've shown, have been reignited again and again and distorted in certain ways. So I don't want to just be the gloom and doom guy. So the question is, how do we even hope to start addressing all of this? Not by feeling guilty about slavery. That's too simple and ultimately doesn't change anything. But rather by acknowledging it and confronting it, by recognizing how we have all been shaped by the ghosts of our collective past and the world they created and that we inherited. To accept our nation's past transgressions and to resolve collectively to move forward together to make a better and more just America. You know, I am at heart a historian of the 19th century, and I'm frankly a bit uncomfortable wading into the late 20th and early 21st century. Yet when I seek a guide, I often look to a person who recognized this problem long before much of what I talked about tonight. And those of you who know me might know that my answer is going to be Abraham Lincoln. I always come back to Lincoln. We might be inspired by his 1862 message to Congress. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so must we think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. In that last sentence, he beat Faulkner by 70 years. But I want to look instead to what I consider the greatest speech in American history. With all due respect to other speeches I have great respect for, the I Have a Dream speech, many of FDR's speeches, Bobby Kennedy's speech on the death of Martin Luther King, many other ones that I have such great respect for. But to my mind, the greatest speech in American history is Lincoln's second inaugural, given in March of 1865. Just weeks before Lee surrendered Appomattox. Think about this. He's been reelected. The Union has not won the war, but everybody knows that in the spring will come the final campaigns that will eventually lead to the defeat of the South. One could be forgiven as President of the United States, who had seen everything he had seen over the past 4 years, of being a little boastful, of congratulating himself and the Northern public and patting everyone on the back and saying what a great job they had done. And yet, that is not what this speech does. He began by summarizing the situation in 1861 and the cause of the war. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. The vice president of the Confederacy said slavery is the cause of the war in the weeks before Fort Sumter. Lincoln said it in the weeks before Appomattox. Let us be done with that argument. They understood. They were not victims of the distortions that would follow their deaths. Then Lincoln considered the unprecedented cataclysm of the war. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which is already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. The war surprised everyone in frightening ways. Yet if God, and yet he then pivots. Yet if God wills that the war continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash, that is, by masters on the enslaved, shall be paid by another drawn with the sword on the battlefields of the Civil War. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. He pivots and says, the war is God's judgment upon the United States, on the entire United States, for allowing slavery to exist for 2.5 centuries. And this is the retribution. He knew that the deaths of so many Americans had to have a larger meaning, and the meaning could not be swept under the rug and forgotten. But then he began to pivot again. And he began a pivot that we as a nation still haven't fully made. He believed this to be true of all Americans. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. He's actually falling into meter there. But then there was a reckoning. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with the world. Not union wounds, not union orphans, not union widows. If we accepted together that we had been on this path together, then we could come together and begin to heal this massive rift that is so much a part of the American identity. And I got on a roll and got way ahead of my notes here. Okay, so I'm doing this one-handed now. Okay. That was the path of reconciliation and acknowledgement that white Americans did not take in the 1880s and beyond. But that left out, yes, there was a brief rapprochement between Southern whites and Northern whites to make things better, to have joint reunions, to try to move on beyond a legacy. But that left out those who had been the central focus of the war and their future within the American fabric as well. And in some ways, they continue to be dismissed, and all too often in the calculus of American history and democracy since. So that is the legacy of the Civil War, a war at its root caused by slavery, followed by a partial peace amongst whites that was bought at the cost of the abandonment of African Americans. The symbols of the Confederacy and the lost cause remain powerful reminders not only of the distortions of the Civil War and its cause, but of a promise unfulfilled. The Confederate flag is not a harmless reminder of a distant past. If we do not recognize this, if we do not begin to find a way to confront our history straight on and have hard and honest conversations, then we can never cherish a just and lasting peace amongst ourselves and all nations. What Lincoln called for so long ago and is in some ways still unfulfilled. We need to understand the power and the full meaning of that war and what followed, because if we don't, the very symbols themselves can become the banners that herald the crumbling of American democracy. What struck me on January 6, 2021 is that 12,000 Wisconsin boys went off to war to make sure that that flag never appeared in the United States Capitol. What would they think of that symbol? They would say that that guy doesn't really know the powerful symbols he's playing with. Beyond all the modern politics I don't want to get into, he doesn't fully understand, or maybe he does, and we need to talk about that, right? I leave you with one final challenge, and I'm gonna move to Lincoln, as I always do, because one last quote of his, and it's one that's not as well known. It continues to haunt and inspire me both in these troubled times. It is not, can any of us imagine better, but can we all do better? That is how slavery caused the Civil War, and that is why it matters today more than ever. Thank you.